So Cynthia Choi is the co-executive director of the Chinese for Affirmative Action. Today, she's going to share with us a lot of information about what she's seeing on the ground. She's a dedicated community organizer and leader. She's led she has led local and state efforts on a wide range of issues, from reproductive justice to gender-based violence, immigration, refugee rights, and environmental justice issues on both the nonprofit sector as well as in philanthropy. She most recently is known as a spokesperson on Asian hate crimes, as she has led the collaborative effort with the Asian Pacific Planning and Policy Council to launch the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center, to really understand how this is really impacting all of us. And so with that, I want to introduce Cynthia Choi and maybe just ask you, what are you seeing on the ground? What are some of the things that you're hearing about?
Well, first I want to just thank you, Assessor Chu, for inviting me to talk about this really important issue. It's so important for us to be able to talk about how everyday folks are being impacted by this pandemic, and in particular, how Asian Americans are experiencing hate during this time. As you shared earlier, we started a reporting center in mid-March. The coronavirus was being racialized, and how Asian Americans were being scapegoated, that we knew that there would be increased incidents of attacks against Asian Americans. And so we have over 1,500 towards Asian Americans. And it's important to note that in California alone, we have had over 35% of incident reports coming from California.
Mm-hmm. I think we might have just a small technical difficulty here, probably a connection issue. So hopefully we'll be able to get Cynthia back on the line. There you are.
Hi, I'm sorry about that. This is the reality of technology. Okay.
It sure is. You were beginning to lay out
technology, right? Yeah. So what I was trying to share with you were a few data points, which is okay. So what I was trying to share is that these incident reports are coming from all across the country, including California, which has the highest number of reports, as well as in the Bay Area. We have about 18% of these cases coming in. Here in San Francisco, we have close to 100 incidents alone. So one of the things that want to be able to share is, some of our key data points. Mm-hmm. A lot of questions that I receive is, oh, how could this be happening in the Bay Area, progressive Bay Area, or even San Francisco?
Right.
And what I do want to share that it is happening here locally and throughout the Bay Area. I'm happy to go over, any of the trends that we're seeing as well, Assessor Chu.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm taking a look at the slide that you have up here, and I think it's a really great point, because I think we've all experienced it on a day-to-day level. I mean, we've seen instances where, even myself, when you go out, especially when this was first, before shelter in place was truly kind of in order, we saw people who were looking at people a different way when they were on public transportation and coughing just because they were clearing their throat. We've seen people who have been refused in terms of service, to jump into a cab or to grab a ride. And I think we've even seen just people being yelled at from buses when they're going about their daily lives. And so, I think these things really, you kind of see it, and we see it also with, I think when schools were in place too, there was some bullying that was happening where kids were making fun of Asian American kids because, the way that it was being portrayed was this was a Chinese virus or was an Asian virus, right? And so I think it's a real thing that people were feeling. But on the stats that I just saw on that page that you showed earlier, something jumped out at me. And if we can bring up that slide one more time, and I'm curious to hear about this, but there's a
Sure.
stat that talks about how Asian American women are 2 times more likely, or have reported 2 times more number of incidences of harassment than men. And I wonder if you can speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a notable trend that we've seen, and there could be a variety of reasons. Are women more likely to report incidents? Are they the ones who are, because of the shelter-in-place order, there are very few places that we can go, which is like the grocery stores and pharmacies and big box retail.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say that, of course, we know statistically that women encounter more harassment. And there's also a question in our minds about, are Asian women more vulnerable to being harassed
Mm-hmm.
because of stereotypes and perceived notions that we're going to be docile, not defend ourselves, and speak out.
Mm-hmm.
But it is something that I think we have to look at very carefully and think about what we need to do to protect ourselves and our families.
Mm-hmm. There's more information, I think, on the next slide that I know that you're planning to share. I'm wondering if we can go to the next one over.
Sure.
And let's talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing in California, because so this slide really breaks down a little bit more about who's receiving some of the hate, and then the types of discrimination that you're seeing. Can you speak a little bit about sort of who's experiencing it, and
Yeah.
then also the type of discrimination that people are facing?
Yes, I'm happy to. So what we're seeing through our data is that all APIs are being subjected to anti-Asian hate and xenophobia. But you can see that Chinese are experiencing it at a greater level, or at least reporting it. And you can see from the descriptions of the incident report that even if the person who is actually being targeted is not Chinese, the intention is to direct it towards a Chinese person. Statements like "Go back to China," or "You Chinese people brought this virus. You're responsible for the deaths under this pandemic." So we know that the vitriol and hate is really targeting the Chinese community, but we also know that there are no distinctions, right? And this is
Right.
the forever, perpetual foreigner
Yeah.
dynamic that we all experience here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course, I do want to take a moment to say that we're very careful about the language that we use. We call our reporting center, we describe the range of incidents as hate, meaning that, a majority are verbal harassment. I wouldn't call them microaggressions because they're actually harrowing experiences where people are called racist, misogynistic slurs that I can't even say on this webinar because it's just so traumatizing, the kinds of things that are being said to people. But it's really suggesting that Asians are diseased, are unclean, that we're responsible. And I think this points to the overall, sort of racist perceptions about when there's a public health crisis like this, the tendency to want to blame foreigners, or who we think to be the host or likely to have caused the disease. And we just know from the science and from public health experts that that's actually incorrect. There is a percentage of what we call physical assaults, which we could describe as hate crimes. And then there's another category of what we would consider civil rights violations. So discrimination that people are experiencing in the workplace, being denied public transportation or private share rides, being banned from establishments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And certainly, I think these are all, remember, we're still sheltering in place. So I
Right.
think we can expect the types of discrimination that people encounter to change once those orders are lifted.
Absolutely. Do you think you can share a little bit more and expand on this? Because I mean, even for myself, I think this, it would be good to just have a clearer understanding of what rises to a hate crime as opposed to actions of hate.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we get that a lot, right? So, there's federal hate crimes legislation, and then there's also state level hate crimes legislation. And California has some of the strongest hate crimes legislation on the books. Um, uh, Hate speech is protected by the U.S. Constitution
Yeah.
unless it is deemed to be interfering with one's civil rights. A threat or property damage could be construed as such for any of the protected classes. So, if you look at what's happening to many Asian Americans, the solution is not a policing one, right? Because there's no enforcement mechanism around being verbally harassed, as despicable as that is.
Right.
So we do have to come up with other strategies to address this type of hate and the spread of hate.
That's a great segue, because I think so many people are going to be facing that. They're going to be, when the city and when the Bay Area and our larger communities start to open, we're going to have many more interactions, and you may continue to see that there are going to be hate language directed at you, right? Or something that's going to happen. Some of it we hope is not going to be physical, obviously, but I think for many people who experience it, and I know I have too, when you kind of get thrown, when someone is calling you something that it's just so jarring and unexpected, because you just don't think that it's going to happen in this day and age. But then you get this discriminatory thing or this really hateful speech that comes at you, and you don't know where it's coming from. And immediately you're kind of like, what do I do with that? Right. Do you have, what kind of tips or thoughts do you have about how people can cope with or deal with if you are a victim of that kind of an assault or harassment? What do you do?
Right. I mean, I think I'd love to start off by talking about some of the stories that we started getting through the reporting center. And, basically what we were seeing is this vitriol, this hate being directed at Asian Americans, walking their neighborhoods, walking their
Right.
dogs, going to the grocery store. And some of the things that people encounter, like getting spit on and
Right.
being physically attacked. And so one of the things that, we saw was that people were just shocked. They were paralyzed. They didn't know what to do. Instinctively, individuals don't necessarily say, I need to call the police, because it's often a fleeting incident. And so that's one of the reasons why we developed some common sense, easily shareable tools to address this issue, and to provide some easy ways to protect yourself in this harrowing time.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could bring up the first slide. So one of the things that we really want to share with individuals is that we know that there has been a history of anti-Asian racism. And so we have to think about the fact that, in these times, what are practical things that we can do to protect ourselves? So if we go to the slide, the first slide on the tools, I'd love to just read the quote, which is, Asian American communities are no stranger to xenophobia and prejudice.
Right.
And this has been a part of our history. And so what can we do to educate ourselves and to heal ourselves and to build solidarity around these issues? So the next slide really is about, 5 things that you can consider if you're experiencing
Mm-hmm.
hate. And we wrote these tips in consultation with groups that serve vulnerable communities. So
Mhm.
not everyone is able to speak out to say, hey, you need to stop being a racist or stop doing that.
Right.
We want to also take into account that we have vulnerable community members, you know, elderly, etc. So this is really centering on safety. So you have to make your best judgment about your surrounding. And if you're able to, leave the situation immediately. We also are encouraging that in this time, it's natural to be scared, to be emotional, but take a moment to just breathe, and to really take hold of yourself, because I think the first thing one wants to do is to panic and to lash out. And so what we do say is, if you are able to calmly establish boundaries, please don't come towards me, please stay away, and to denounce that behavior. And again, not everyone is able to do that, especially our limited English speaking
Right.
community members.
Right.
Number four, if there are bystanders around, ask for support, because a lot of times we live in a society right now where it's like, oh, I just need to mind my own business. I don't know what's going on. I don't want to get involved. So if you ask, if you solicit it, people are more likely to help and step in. And then
Mhm.
number five, we are encouraging people to just recognize that this is not your fault, that it's okay if you feel emotional and unstable, that you need to really take some measures to seek professional help and support where you can. And so many reports that we received, very emotional, of, you know, I just didn't know what to do and I just started crying, or feeling like they were alone. And so we are encouraging, if folks can, to get professional support, and also to seek support from your friends and your
Mhm.
family.
Mhm. You know, one of the things that I've noticed too, you know, you mentioned earlier this idea of seeking immediate support from the bystanders around you, because it is true. When you're in a crowd, everyone's like, well, someone else is going to make that telephone call or someone else is going to step in, right? I don't have to do it. And so I think really calling out people to say, can you help me, really starts to basically jar people out of what they were thinking. And a lot of people will say, of course I will, right? And so, you know, I wonder if you have some thoughts about what people who are seeing something happen can do. So I might not be the person that hate is being directed at, but if I'm watching it happen, what are some things that our allies and people who are watching can do? Because I think there are many people outside of AAPI community members who would also denounce that kind of behavior. And so what can other people do?
Yeah, you're so right. And that was one of the things that we also saw through our reporting center, that while the hate directed at them was so hurtful and
Yeah.
painful, what was worse was to have people around them say nothing, to be
Yep.
silent. And
Yep.
so that's one of the reasons why we also developed an accompanying easy tips to do if you're witnessing hate. And
Hmm.
so on our next slide, I want to lift up Mia Mingus, who is part of a collective effort, who recognizes that most people who experience violence turn to their immediate, close, tight network, your
Hmm.
partner, your family, your neighbors, and less likely to call the police, especially if it's not at a level that rises to a hate crime.
Right.
We're not even likely to reach out to a community-based organization. So what do we do to address that? It's important that I think we think about that, you know, longer term. But five easy things that you can do when you're witnessing hate, because I do believe that most decent people will recognize this is wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if given an opportunity, would love to step in. So one of the things that we want to do is to center your attention and your support to the person that's being targeted. and to think about their well-being as well as your own safety, because attackers can also direct their animus to other people that try to intervene. We've seen how that has played out. It's also focused on de-escalation. So make sure you approach the targeted person to let them know, I am here for you, I support you. Obviously with social distancing, do it in a way that's safe.
Yeah.
It's about really listening to the person and really respecting that person's wish. So some people might instinctively say, oh, I want to call the police. But maybe that targeted person doesn't feel safe doing that because of their status or whatever the reason is. Respect their wish around that. And number 3, don't ignore the situation, as you pointed out, but ignore the aggressor, because you don't want to escalate the situation. And again, the person who is attacking could also direct their hate towards you and put you in danger. So you also have to do a safety assessment. We also encourage number 4 to, once, if you feel like the situation is starting to escalate, to accompany the person who's being targeted, so that in greater numbers, there's more safety, right? And hopefully there'll be, more than one, bystander to step in to help with the situation, especially if it gets more heated and more complicated. And then finally, really, when you are feeling in a safe situation, to really ask the person how they're feeling, to validate them, to remind them that, this is not okay, and to assist them in figuring out what they want to do next. And so whether that's helping them get home safely, whether it's, helping them contact their close family friend, these are all really, really practical things that you can do. And this applies to any group that's being targeted, really, not just Asian Americans. And so we're hoping
absolutely. And I think this is it's really helpful because, it's one thing to see the statistics. It's quite another thing when it actually happens to you, and then you see it happening, and I think there, like you mentioned earlier, there's a bit of paralysis where, you're just so shocked by the action happening in this day and age that sometimes we don't react the way that we would want to. And so I think having this toolkit of just very straightforward and helpful things that you can do to help when you're a bystander, or even if you're in the situation, I think is really helpful for people. Cynthia, I've got a few questions from people that they've submitted earlier, and so I'm going to ask a few of you and see what your thoughts are. There's a question that came in that asked, do you have data on hate crimes against AAPI hate crimes against children? Anywhere we can find tips or guidance on how to help kids experiencing hate crimes?
Oh gosh, as a parent, and I'm sure Assessor Chu, this resonates for you too. Those are probably the most heartbreaking stories. So we have about little over 6% of the incidents involve children, and we also include incidents where children or youth are also acting out hate. So, so this tells us that, one, we need to figure out, and there are actually resources that are already developed to help parents talk to their children about this time. I have an 11-year-old, and she is, witnessing the work that I'm doing and hearing all these conversations that I'm having. And so I do have conversations with her that really is age appropriate, to make sure that she understands, what's happening. And we've had prior conversations because she's learned about the civil rights movement and what happened, during the neo-Nazi era. Like, how do entire groups of people become targeted? It just doesn't compute for children. And we do have incident reports where parents have reported on behalf of their children that they were called the coronavirus, that they were targeted, and the parents noticed depression
Yeah.
and statements like, I wish I wasn't Asian, which is
Mm-hmm.
so heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
And so this tells me, what are conversations that we need to have with school districts to prepare and to make sure that existing anti-bullying programs incorporate policies and protocols and tools to address this form of bullying.
Yeah.
So I think that's urgent, and I think about the once the bruises and broken bones healed, it's the psychological aspects of it that
Yeah.
really are long lasting and require, attention.
Yeah. I think your point is right about, you know, we know right now that with the schools not being in session, that it's a different scenario. So kids might be experiencing it, maybe if they're out and about and somehow they're experiencing it. But when we are ready to bring kids back in a school setting, I think it is really a great idea, and we should be doing this to really engage our school districts to say, how are you preparing for this? Not only to help teachers and people who are at the school sites identify when it's happening, but how do you support students when they're in it? I think there's also a component of making sure that we're providing resources for parents, because I know even for a lot of elementary schools, for example, they receive letters from the schools every week. And so is there a way to communicate en masse to all of our parents to say, this is something that we want to make sure that you're aware of. If you are seeing these kinds of signs in your kids, as you mentioned, depression or certain comments, that you're just aware that something might be happening, and to give parents a way to recognize, identify it, and maybe take action, because I think we all want the best for our kids, and it really is heartbreaking, kind of hits you right at the center
Yeah.
when our kids are kind of in such a hard place. So
Yeah, and those ideas are fantastic, because there are ways that we should be able to reach parents and to give them the support that they need.
yeah,
So I really love those ideas, and we have an opportunity to work with our commissioners
yeah,
and folks in education around it.
absolutely.
I'd
I've
love
got
to
a
work with you
question.
on that.
I'm
Yeah,
happy to help. I'm happy to work on that with you.
yeah.
There's a question from an attendee who has asked, do you have suggestions on how to engage allies to stop hate who are not members of the API community?
Yeah, that is such a great question, and I want to offer some silver lining to this whole situation. Is that that's already happening, where we are having conversations with other communities. In fact, we're reaching out and have had discussions with members of the Arab and Muslim and South Asian community who experienced
Yeah,
tremendous backlash post
mhm,
9/11 and even before then.
right.
So we're talking to them about lessons learned. We are, wherever we can, talking about the disparate impacts on African Americans and the Latinx community.
Yeah,
We have shared fate around these set of issues. And the theme that keeps coming up, whoever I'm talking to, is the fact that the pandemic has exposed underlying, enduring challenges for us as a community and as a society,
yeah,
which is structural. It has to do with the fact that so many people were struggling pre-pandemic and are just hanging on by a thread now during this really difficult time, and we're nowhere near understanding what it's going to be like on the other side of this. So I'm happy to say that it is happening, and there needs to be more of it. And I think what's happening now, I think, is like the first phase, which is community leaders and elected officials are having these discussions. And now we need to make sure that communities on the front lines, grassroots communities, also are part of those conversations. And those are discussions that we're having right now. So it's a
that's
really
great.
positive thing.
That's great. Do you have any suggestions? This is a question that came in on how. So I think a lot of people are hearing kind of the rhetoric that is happening nationally on COVID-19, and even before then. And so the question is, what can we do to protect the community and diffuse the anger with the current rhetoric ratcheting up, especially during a presidential election?
Oh gosh, I'm going to ask you that question, Sister Chu. I mean, I'd love to have a conversation with you about that. It's so important that our community, one, recognizes that any elected official that uses this opportunity to scapegoat our community to score political points should not get our vote.
Yeah.
And we should be vocal and visible. Complete your census. If you can
Yes.
and are able to vote, if you're able to get involved in your local community and your faith community, school community, whatever community you feel connected to talk about these issues, this is the way that we condemn any attempts to scapegoat us again. And this is not something new. And unfortunately, it's not just one political party. Um, so we have to make sure that no matter who the elected official is, that we condemn it at every opportunity that we can. I'd love to
Yeah.
get your thoughts about this too.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I think in our, my parents are immigrants to the United States, and their English isn't that great. They've worked really hard and all that. But if you were to say, okay, mom and dad, I need you to speak up and go talk to your legislator, or to go protest or do whatever it is, they would just be reluctant to do it because I think there's an inhibition because they don't feel like they can communicate well. And, that just adds an extra layer to they're not doing that kind of work. But that being said, I think it is really important for us to be speaking out whenever we see those actions happening. And the one thing that I will say is that every time something happens where we see API community members or others being scapegoated or being portrayed in a way that is stereotypical, that creates divisiveness, we need to speak out against it. And I think the challenge that at least I see sometimes is that I don't know it happened until later on, because there's so much going on in all of our worlds. We're thinking about how it is that we're going to help small businesses right now. We're trying to figure out how to get information to help people get into unemployment insurance, for example. There's just so much going on that sometimes when those things happen, we may not know about it until later. And then when it happens later, it almost seems like it's too late to say something, right? And so I do think that if there is a way for us to be coordinated with response, to have certain folks or entities who can kind of be watchful of these things and be ready at a moment's notice to issue, a statement against it with a lot of support. So with a lot of organizations who are like, I am on board with you. And when these letters come out, I'm ready to go. You just tell me when, and I will sign on to something. I think that could be really helpful too. So I think you're absolutely right. We do have to speak up. We have to speak out when we see these incidences happening, not only to our community, but to our allies and others as well, because we need to build support that way. But I also think that it is helpful if we have pre-existing coalitions that are ready at a moment's notice to really respond. Because just coming from my own perspective, there's so much going on that sometimes you don't know about some of these things happening until later. And then you want to say something, but it also feels like, well, that happened a week ago. Isn't that too late for me to say something now? Right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. The way that the situation so rapidly evolves, I mean, like, in less than 24 hours, the situation can dramatically change. And you know that really well, Assessor Chu. I do feel as though this is about our moment as a community to become organized and prepared to stand up wherever we can. And so we have advocacy organizations that can work with our elected officials to condemn this. And this is at the congressional level to local school boards. We also have mental health providers that are also coming together to think about how do we reach families that are being directly affected. And so this is a moment where we can once again show how the Asian community can rise to the situation. It's in our DNA, like times before. But of course, you know, this is unprecedented,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you think about the different periods of anti-Asian backlash, anti-immigrant backlash. There's no playbook for this. You know, how do you respond to the fact that, I mean, today I saw the numbers, you know, 55,000 lost lives in the United States alone, the economic destruction. So we have to use this opportunity to prepare for the long term. And I
Yeah.
think that I think if there's ever going to be a moment to do that, it would be now.
Yeah, no, absolutely agreed. Well, I'm really glad that you came on today, and I'm glad that we had a chance to speak a little bit about this, and I'm happy to partner with you however I can be helpful. But I think to our larger community who's watching, whether you're an AAPI member or you are an ally, I think it really is time for us to come together and make sure that we say together that it's not acceptable and that this is not the best of us and this is not what we aspire to be. And so I think there's a lot of takeaways that I have from this session. So thank you so much, Cynthia, for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I'm looking forward to working with you on these issues moving
Sounds
forward.
good.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.